1902 London, the doctor who cured death, but who woke up after surgery wanted his life back. London, 1902. The city trembled beneath the weight of its own progress, smoke from 1,000 chimneys blurring the sky, the echo of carriage wheels blending with the distant toll of St. Paul's. It was an age of invention and ambition, yet behind the glittering facade of modern medicine, there were secrets best left untouched, and at the heart of that darkness stood one man, Dr. Alaric Hensley, the physician who claimed he had cured death itself. They called him the Miracle Doctor, a surgeon whose patients never died, whose scalpel defied the limits of flesh and fate. But tonight, you'll hear what no one was meant to know. The truth buried beneath years of silence, sealed in hospital ledgers, whispered by those who swore they'd seen the impossible. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why his final patient begged to die again. It began inside a crumbling brick hospital on the east side of London, a place meant for the poor, the dying, and the forgotten. The stench of ether and blood clung to its walls like ghosts of failed experiments. Dr. Hensley worked there late into the night, long after the other physicians had gone home, his lamp burning behind closed doors. Nurses whispered that he spoke to his instruments, that he took notes in a language no one could read. But what unsettled them most was the sound, the faint rhythm of a heartbeat coming from the operating table, even when no patient lay upon it. No one dared question him. His reputation protected him, and his results spoke louder than any rumor. He revived men struck down by fever, soldiers torn apart by shrapnel, even a child pronounced dead for nearly an hour. The newspapers adored him. The London Gazette wrote, "Dr. Hensley's knife has made the impossible routine." But what the public never saw were the nights when the morgue lights flickered and one of the bodies disappeared. Those who worked under him knew something unnatural was happening. He'd locked the surgical theater from the inside, and when he emerged, his hands trembled as though he'd seen God himself, or something far worse. He'd stare at his reflection, whispering, "They will thank me one day, when death itself obeys." And yet, every miracle demands a price. Rumor spread that he was experimenting with a forbidden serum, one extracted not from medicine, but from the dead. His assistant, a timid man named Fletcher, confessed in his final letter that the doctor had ordered him to retrieve fresh subjects from the graveyard. Fletcher's words, later found soaked in ink and rain, ended abruptly. He says they still think. He says they dream even after the heart stops. What if he was right? What if death could be reversed, but the soul could not return the same? Tonight, you'll see the consequences of that discovery. You'll hear about the patient who rose from the table, breathing once more, but whose eyes screamed for release. The man who came back wrong, and if you stay until the end, you'll uncover the exclusive record that was hidden for over a century, the lost journal of Dr. Hensley himself, recovered from beneath the ruins of St. Bartholomew's Hospital after the fire of 1913. Inside it lies the final entry, a confession so disturbing that historians refuse to publish it. But I'll reveal it to you, only at the end of this story. So listen carefully. Imagine the flicker of gaslight on steel. Picture the trembling hand of a man who believes he's conquered mortality. Feel the chill that runs through his veins when the corpse beneath his knife suddenly exhales. That's where our story begins, not with life, but with the mockery of it. You see, Dr. Hensley's greatest triumph was never meant to save anyone. It was meant to prove a theory that no human should ever test, that consciousness could be revived, reshaped, and controlled. But when the body awoke, it didn't thank him. It looked at him with recognition and hatred. It whispered something that froze the doctor, S-Heart, 3 words no one else in the room could hear. By the time his assistants returned, the patient was gone, and Hensley stood staring at the empty table, muttering, "He wants his life back." That night, The doctor disappeared from public record. No obituary, no funeral, no trace. Only his house remained. Doors locked, windows blackened, and a strange humming that neighbors swore came from the basement long after he was gone. If you've ever wondered what happens when man dares to play God, stay with me. Because before this story ends, you'll see how the line between life and death, once crossed, can never be redrawn. And one last thing. Those who stay until the end will hear the words that Dr. Hensley wrote moments before vanishing. Words meant not for his peers, but for those who would one day uncover his truth. Consider this your only warning. Once you know what he discovered, you'll never sleep the same again. At the dawn of the 20th century, London stood on the edge of two worlds, one built on the proud achievements of science and progress, the other sinking slowly into the rot of its own secrets. Gas lamps flickered against soot-stained bricks, and the Thames carried more than the city's refuse. It carried whispers, rumors, and the scent of something unnatural brewing beneath polite society. This was the age of reason, but reason had its limits. And men like Dr. Alaric Hensley existed to break them. Medicine in 1902 was a fragile faith. The rich placed their trust in doctors armed with scalpels and morphine, while the poor prayed not to be buried alive. Electricity was still a novelty in most wards, and anesthesia, unreliable, inconsistent, danced on the edge of nightmare. The human body was an experiment waiting to fail. Yet there were those who believed that science could conquer even death, and Hensley was their prophet. He had studied in Edinburgh, where anatomy and ambition mixed like blood in the gutters. Those who knew him then spoke of a man obsessed with more than healing. He wanted to understand what happened in the seconds after life faded. He spent nights beside corpses, watching their faces as if waiting for one to breathe again. When he arrived in London, he brought with him an unsettling conviction that death was not an ending but a barrier, thin, temporary, and waiting to be broken. The city itself mirrored his madness. London was a living corpse, stitched together by progress. Trains howled beneath the earth, the air stank of iron and smoke, and hospitals overflowed with those who believed science could save them from their own decay. The working poor, trapped in factories and slums, offered their bodies to medical schools for a few shillings. The hospitals took them, dead or alive. Dr. Hensley's hospital stood in Whitechapel, a district already haunted by the shadows of another killer. The name Hensley Infirmary was painted in gold above the entrance, though few dared to enter after dark. Inside, marble corridors met dimly lit wards, where whispers traveled faster than footsteps. The smell of carbolic acid hung thick in the air, masking something else, a deeper, older stench that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Records from that year show a series of unexplained disappearances. Patients who had been declared dead at dawn were gone by dusk. Nurses reported faint lights from the lower wings, corridors that no longer appeared on the building's blueprints. It was said that Dr. Hensley had personally ordered their closure, yet every night a soft metallic clinking echoed from behind those sealed doors, like instruments being prepared for a procedure that never ended. The era worshipped progress, but feared it too. Newspapers praised scientists who electrified corpses for research, while priests condemned them as blasphemers. Public lectures drew crowds with promises of demonstrating the spark of reanimation. Even Queen Victoria's death that very year had renewed the city's obsession with mortality. What happened after the last breath, and whether man might someday steal back what nature took. And in that feverish atmosphere, Hensley's name rose like a dark miracle. Reports of his resurrections spread quietly among the elite, whispers traded at private clubs and university halls. A nobleman's son revived after drowning. A factory worker breathing again after a boiler explosion. None of them spoke publicly afterward. In fact, most vanished. Some said they had been sent abroad for treatment. Others claimed they had never returned to themselves. The truth was far stranger. Behind the respectable facade of the infirmary, Hensley's private laboratory stretched beneath the main ward, a maze of tunnels built during the cholera outbreaks decades earlier. He converted them into operating chambers, lining the walls with polished brass instruments and glass jars filled with organs suspended in amber light. There, the air was heavy and humming, charged with static and the scent of ozone. It was here that he tested his theory, that life could be preserved if the soul were given something to cling to. But no one knew what that meant, or what he used to achieve it. Some said he'd harnessed electricity. Others whispered that his serum came from something far older than science. Whatever it was, it worked, but at a cost that even he could not predict. Outside, London continued its restless march into modernity. The newspapers spoke of hope, invention, and empire. But beneath the headlines, in the shadowed streets and forgotten morgues, something else stirred. An unease, a sense that humanity was crossing a threshold it could never return from. And so, when the night of the experiment arrived, no one questioned why the infirmary's windows were shrouded or why the gas lamps outside flickered blue. No one heard the screams, muffled by stone and distance. Only the next morning did a nurse find the operating room empty, except for a single note on the blood-stained table, written in Hensley's trembling hand. "He woke before I finished, and he remembers." That was the moment history began to forget. But tonight we remember, and the city's silence begins to speak again. Before Dr. Hensley became the man who defied death, he was simply Alaric, a physician who still believed that saving lives was a holy act. Those who knew him in the early days remembered a man with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands that never trembled. He was meticulous, even tender when treating the poor who came to the infirmary. He spoke softly to the dying, promising them peace beyond the veil. But behind that calm exterior, a storm was brewing, a fascination with what happened in the space between the last heartbeat and silence. Hensley was not alone in his work. By his side was his devoted assistant, Jonathan Fletcher, a timid man of 30 who owed the doctor his life. Fletcher had once been a patient, a failed suicide who Hensley had rescued from the edge of the Thames. The doctor's intervention had saved his body, but left his spirit hollow, eternally indebted. To Hensley, Fletcher became more than an assistant. He was a witness, someone who could validate his genius when the world refused to understand. The two men shared long nights in the cold glow of the laboratory lamps. Fletcher took notes, measured pulse rates, and scrubbed the instruments clean until his fingers bled. Yet he could never ignore the feeling that his mentor's work was crossing an invisible line. Sometimes he swore the patients' bodies twitched, even after the procedures had ended. Once, he saw a woman's eyes flutter open, but there was no life in them, only a reflection of something that didn't belong. Then there was Margaret Ellery, a nurse with auburn hair and a gaze too steady for her own good. She joined the infirmary after losing her brother to pneumonia. Unlike most nurses, she didn't fear Hensley, she challenged him. She was drawn to his brilliance, yet repulsed by his indifference. She believed healing came from compassion, not control. The tension between them was quiet but electric. When he operated, she watched, not with admiration, but with dread. She saw what others refused to see, that Hensley's eyes lit not with empathy, but with hunger. Margaret was the first to question his experiments openly. "You bring them back," she whispered one night as they cleaned the operating room. "But do you ever ask what comes back with them?" Hensley didn't answer. He only smiled faintly and said, "If we feared the unknown, we'd still be crawling in the dark." But Margaret's fear wasn't of the unknown. It was of him. Each of them carried their own wound, Fletcher's guilt, Margaret's grief, Hensley's obsession. They were bound together by a common lie, that saving life was always noble, yet deep down, each knew that their work inside that infirmary had ceased to be about saving anyone. It had become about proving something, to God, to death, to themselves. In early December of 1902, the doctor received a visitor who would change everything, a wealthy industrialist named Charles Pembroke. Pembroke was a powerful man, the owner of factories that clothed half of London and starved the other half. His wife had died 3 years earlier, and his only son Edward lay dying of consumption. He offered Hensley a fortune if he could do what no doctor could, bring Edward back, even if only for one more breath. Hensley accepted without hesitation. For him, it wasn't about the money. It was about validation. "If I succeed," he told Fletcher, "they will never question me again. Death itself will be my patient." In the days that followed, the infirmary became a tomb of secrets. The other doctors were dismissed. The staff avoided the East Wing. Only Hensley, Fletcher, and Margaret remained. They prepared the operating room with ritual precision, sterilizing instruments, drawing curtains, lighting the gas lamps until the walls shimmered like gold. The air was heavy, as if time itself held its breath. On the eve of the operation, Margaret found Hensley sitting alone in his study, staring at a small silver locket. Inside it was a photograph, a woman with soft eyes and a kind smile. "My wife," he said quietly, though she had never heard him speak of her before. "She died in childbirth. I promised her I'd find a way to make death surrender." His voice trembled, not with sadness, but with pride. "Tomorrow, I will keep that promise." For the first time, Margaret saw him not as a monster, but as a man haunted by loss, one who had mistaken grief for destiny. She wanted to tell him to stop, to let the dead rest, but his eyes, illuminated by the flicker of the lamp, were already too far gone. That night, as snow began to fall outside the infirmary, Fletcher wrote in his journal, "He no longer prays before he begins. Perhaps he no longer believes there's anyone listening." By morning, the table was ready, the serum was prepared, and the doctor's heart beat with the rhythm of madness disguised as faith. And though none of them knew it yet, the moment Edward Pembroke took his first breath again, every life in that room would be forever changed. The operation took place on a frozen December morning, when the city still slept beneath a veil of fog. The gas lamps burned low, their glow swallowed by the cold mist seeping through the cracks in the infirmary's windows. In the operating theatre, the air was still, too still. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the gas line feeding the lamps, and the faint ticking of a clock that seemed to mark the final seconds before God looked away. Edward Pembroke's body lay motionless on the table, pale and thin, his chest sunken, lips blue. The sickness had consumed him, but Hensley refused to see decay. He saw potential. Margaret stood by the basin, hands trembling as she prepared the instruments. Fletcher hovered by the door, his journal pressed to his chest, as though it could protect him. "Scalpel," Hensley said, and his voice carried the authority of prophecy. For hours, the doctor worked in silence. Veins were opened, the serum injected, electrodes fastened to temples and chest. The scent of burnt flesh mingled with ether. When Hensley signaled for the final dose, Fletcher hesitated. "Sir, if this fails—" "It won't," Hensley cut him off. His eyes were fever-bright. "Death is not a failure, Fletcher. It's a habit." The last injection sank into the boy's vein. For a moment, nothing. Then a twitch, barely perceptible, but enough. The corpse's fingers curled. Margaret gasped, stepping back so quickly she nearly slipped. A low sound followed, a soft rattling breath, like the hiss of air escaping through cracked glass. Edward Pembroke was breathing. Fletcher stared, his lips moving in silent prayer. Margaret's heart pounded. Hensley only smiled, that cold, victorious smile of a man who believed he had rewritten the laws of creation. "You see," he whispered, "he's crossed the veil," and returned. But something was wrong. The boy's eyes opened, not slowly, as one waking from sleep, but with sudden violence, like a creature startled into existence. His pupils were wide, unfocused, his skin turning a strange shade of grey. He looked around the room, as though searching for something that wasn't there. Then his gaze fixed on Hensley. It wasn't recognition, it was accusation. "Where am I?" the boy rasped, voice brittle as parchment. The doctor leaned in, triumphant. "You're alive, Edward! I've brought you back!" Edward's lips twitched, forming a shape that almost resembled a smile. "No," he whispered. "You didn't bring me back. You kept me from leaving." The lamps flickered. The temperature seemed to drop, a frost forming along the steel instruments. Margaret felt a pressure in her chest, as though the air itself resisted their presence. Edward began to convulse, his limbs jerking violently. Hensley tried to restrain him, shouting for Fletcher to hold him down, but the boy's strength was unnatural. The moment Margaret reached for his wrist, she felt it, a pulse that beat too fast, too strong, as if two hearts were struggling within one body. Then, as suddenly as it began, the convulsions stopped. Edward lay still once more. Hensley exhaled, relief breaking through the mania. "It's only the shock," he muttered. "The body's adjusting." But Margaret noticed something the others didn't. The boy's eyes remained open, staring straight ahead, not into the room, but at something behind her. She turned. Nothing. Just the dim glow of the wall lamps and the soft drip of condensation. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Hensley ordered the others to leave him with the patient. Fletcher obeyed immediately, eager to escape the heavy silence. Margaret hesitated. As she turned to go, she caught sight of a dark stain spreading across the floor. Not blood, but something thicker, darker, almost oily. It trailed from beneath the operating table toward the drain. Later that night, when Hensley finally emerged, his gloves were gone and his coat sleeves soaked. He told them the experiment was a success, that Edward was resting. But his voice shook, and his eyes avoided theirs. Margaret returned to clean the room after midnight. The table was empty. The bed prepared for the patient was untouched. Yet one thing remained, the faint outline of a handprint on the glass partition, far too large to be Edward's. And written in the condensation beside it in trembling letters were 3 words that made her drop her lantern. "He remembers everything." The flame died as it hit the floor, plunging the room into darkness, and in that silence she heard it. The faint echo of a heartbeat coming from somewhere deep beneath the infirmary, one that did not belong to the living. The days following the operation dissolved into uneasy silence. Snow piled along the infirmary's iron gates, muffling the city's noise and sealing the building in a strange, frozen stillness. Word spread among the few remaining staff that Edward Pembroke had stabilized, but no one had seen him, not the nurses, not even Fletcher. Dr. Hensley dismissed all inquiries with sharp precision. "He needs isolation. The mind must realign with the body." His tone left no room for questions, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion that had begun to hollow him out. Margaret was the first to notice the change. Hensley no longer ate, slept, or shaved. He carried a lantern into the basement each night and returned only at dawn, his face pale, his coat stained with something dark that didn't quite look like blood. When she dared ask, he told her, "He's improving. You wouldn't understand the process." But she did understand one thing. The more the doctor spoke of progress, the more his humanity seemed to rot away. Fletcher, torn between loyalty and fear, followed Hensley one night. He crept down the spiral staircase that led to the hospital's old tunnels, those long-forgotten corridors built to hide the dead during cholera outbreaks. At the end of one passage, faint light flickered through a crack in the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Inside, he heard murmuring, two voices, not one. Hensley's voice was firm, urgent. "You must tell me what you saw." The other voice, low, hoarse, unnatural, replied, "Darkness, nothing, and then you." Fletcher stumbled back, covering his mouth to keep from gasping. He fled up the stairs before the door creaked open. Later, he found Margaret and told her everything. They both knew what it meant. The patient was alive, yes, but something inhuman had come back with him. The injustice of it burned inside her. Edward Pembroke had been a boy of 19, kind-hearted, generous, doomed only by the poverty his father refused to see. His father's wealth had built empires on broken backs, men and children crushed in the gears of his factories. And now, even in death, Edward's body had been bought and sold for another man's pride. Margaret couldn't stand it. She went to the East Wing that night, hoping to see the boy herself, but the door was locked from the inside. Through the keyhole, she saw only shadows moving, and for a moment, the faint outline of someone standing behind the doctor. It wasn't Edward. It was taller, thinner, a silhouette that swayed with the rhythm of breathing. When she confronted Hensley later, his calm shattered. "Do not interfere," he shouted. "You think I'm cruel. I'm giving him a chance no one ever had." His voice cracked with something almost like desperation. "Do you know what it means to die with unfinished purpose? I've freed him from that injustice." But Margaret saw what he refused to see. He wasn't freeing anyone. He was binding a soul that wanted release. That night, Fletcher found a page torn from the doctor's journal on his desk. It was smeared with ink and something sticky that darkened at the edges. The words were frantic, trembling. The subject speaks in two tones, one his, one not. The second voice claims to remember the grave. It asks for warmth but shuns the light. When I refused to let it go, it began to weep without tears. Fletcher turned pale. "He's keeping him alive against his will," he whispered. "He's torturing him." The next morning, Margaret went to the infirmary's chapel, hoping to pray. But even there, the candles wouldn't stay lit. She found a single medical glove on the altar, Hensley's, and beside it a scrap of cloth from Edward's patient gown. Someone had scratched words into the wood beneath. He can't close his eyes. The realization sank in like ice. Edward was not dead, not alive, trapped somewhere between, a prisoner in his own body. And Hensley, blinded by obsession, called it mercy. Outside, London carried on. Laughter, commerce, carriages clattering through snow, unaware that beneath its streets a boy's soul was screaming in silence. And in that silence, injustice took its truest form, not in what was done to the poor, the sick, or the forgotten, but in what was done in the name of salvation. Margaret made her choice that night. She would find Edward, no matter what it cost. Because some wrongs were too cruel to let God judge alone. The snowstorm that swept through London that week felt like punishment. The infirmary's windows rattled, the chimneys howled, and the gas lamps flickered under the relentless wind. But the true chill came from within the walls. Margaret hadn't seen Dr. Hensley in 2 days. His office remained locked, and the East Wing, where Edward was kept, was guarded by silence. The staff whispered that something inside was moving at night, something heavy dragging across the floors. No one dared investigate. On the third night, Margaret decided she couldn't wait any longer. Fletcher met her at the base of the stairwell, a candle trembling in his hand. "You shouldn't go down there," he said, voice breaking. "He's not alone anymore." "What do you mean?" Fletcher's eyes darted toward the darkness below. "The boy speaks when the doctor isn't in the room, but it's not his voice. It answers questions that haven't been asked." Margaret said nothing. She took the candle and started down the stairs, the air thick with cold and the scent of damp stone. Each step echoed like a heartbeat beneath the infirmary. When they reached the final landing, she saw the corridor she'd only glimpsed before. Walls lined with iron doors, pipes dripping condensation, the faint hum of machines pulsing like veins. The last door on the left was half open. Light spilled out in a thin, trembling line. Margaret pushed it gently and froze. Edward Pembroke lay on the table, his chest rising and falling in shallow, mechanical rhythm. His skin was pale as marble, veins dark beneath the surface. But what truly froze her blood was the movement of his eyes. They weren't closed. They rolled restlessly beneath half-lowered lids, as though something inside was trying to wake up. Dr. Hensley stood beside him, scribbling notes with furious precision. Tubes and wires ran from Edward's body to a large device humming with soft blue light. Sparks jumped occasionally from the metal coil at its center. On the desk nearby, a jar glowed faintly. Inside it, a cluster of something that looked like human tissue pulsed slowly, as if breathing. Margaret stepped forward. "What have you done to him?" Hensley turned, startled, but not ashamed. His face was drawn, eyes sunken. He's adapting. The mind is remembering what the body forgot. He speaks through the impulses now. Every surge, every heartbeat carries a word. "This isn't life," she said. "It's torment. You don't understand." He slammed his hand against the machine. "I've given him continuity. The soul doesn't need heaven. It needs a vessel, and he's proving it." Before Margaret could answer, the lights dimmed. A low hum filled the air, deep and resonant, shaking the floor. Edward's fingers twitched, his chest convulsed, and a sudden burst of steam hissed from the machine. The candles flickered violently. Then, through the crackle of static, a voice emerged. Not Edward's, but something older, hollow and broken. "Why did you wake me?" The words came from Edward's mouth, yet the sound filled the room as if the walls themselves were speaking. Fletcher stumbled back, crossing himself. Margaret clutched the table for balance. Hensley's expression twisted with awe. He remembers. The consciousness is intact. The voice continued, rising, distorting. "You took me from the dark, but you left the rest behind." The glass jars around them began to tremble. One shattered, spilling its contents across the floor. The smell of decay and metal filled the air. The machine sputtered, sparks flying. Hensley reached for the controls, shouting, "It's working! He's merging!" Margaret grabbed his arm. "Stop it! You're killing him!" But Edward's body jerked upward, eyes wide open now, completely black. He stared at the doctor and whispered, almost tenderly, "You shouldn't have followed me." A violent pulse burst from the machine, knocking Margaret and Fletcher to the ground. The light flared and then died. When the noise ceased, the room was silent, except for the faint dripping of liquid onto the floor. Margaret forced herself to stand. The machine was charred, its coils melted. Edward lay motionless, but his chest still rose faintly. Hensley stood trembling, his face spattered with blood from a cut on his cheek. "It spoke," he murmured. "Not him. Something through him." He looked at Margaret, his voice almost childlike. "Do you know what that means?" "There's something on the other side. It can cross back." Margaret stared at the boy's lifeless form. "And what if it's not supposed to?" Hensley didn't answer. He only smiled, a ghost of triumph flickering in his eyes. "Then it will teach us why." When she and Fletcher finally escaped the basement, the first light of dawn was breaking through the snow outside. But even in that fragile morning light, the sound still echoed in Margaret's mind. The voice that had spoken through the dead. It wasn't pleading, it wasn't angry, it was remembering. By the next evening, the storm had passed, but the city hadn't thawed. London wore its frost like a veil of mourning. Inside the infirmary, silence had returned, though it was the wrong kind of silence, the one that listens back. The patients whispered about strange drafts, phantom footsteps, and the faint hum of machinery long after it was turned off. Dr. Margaret tried to convince herself it was all nerves. Yet every time she passed the east wing, she could feel the pull of something beneath her feet, like a slow heartbeat rising from the basement. Dr. Hensley, meanwhile, had resumed his routines as if nothing had happened. He moved with renewed vigor, making rounds, taking notes, speaking softly to his staff. But his eyes had changed. They no longer blinked as often, and when he looked at people, there was a pause too long to be natural, like he was waiting for their thoughts to echo back. One morning, Fletcher found him sitting in the boy's empty room. The bed was stripped, the instruments gone. Only a faint burn mark on the floor remained in the shape of a circle. "Where is Edward?" Fletcher asked. Hensley smiled. "He's resting," he said simply, "but he's still with us." That night, Margaret awoke to a sound coming from the infirmary's courtyard, a scraping, rhythmic and hollow. She threw on her coat and followed it outside. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight. In the center of the yard stood a shape hunched over the frozen ground. It was Edward, or at least something wearing Edward's body. His skin had taken on a waxen hue, his movements stiff but deliberate. He was digging, though the earth was frozen solid. Margaret called out his name, and he stopped, turning slowly toward her. "Help me," he said. The voice was low, trembling, human, but behind it faintly came another whisper, one that wasn't his. "It's still inside." She rushed forward, but as she neared him, she saw what he'd been digging for. The patch of snow had been cleared away, revealing the old stone foundation of the building, and etched into it, beneath the frost, was a symbol. The same one she'd seen burned on the floor in the basement. Edward fell to his knees, clutching his head. "He promised me silence," he groaned. "He said I'd sleep, but it never ends." Then, as suddenly as it began, his body went still. His breath clouded the air once, twice, and stopped. Margaret screamed for help, but when Hensley and Fletcher arrived, the body was gone. Only the symbol remained, faintly glowing beneath the ice. The following day, Hensley locked himself in his study again. Margaret pounded on the door until he finally opened it, his face pale and distant. "It wasn't him," he said softly. "The voice that came through. It wanted something unfinished." Margaret stepped inside and froze. On the wall, drawn in chalk and blood, were dozens of the same symbols. In the center hung Edward's last medical chart, except the handwriting wasn't Hensley's. The notes were written in Latin in a style centuries old, and at the bottom, scrawled in ink that hadn't yet dried, was a single line. "The vessel is prepared. The doctor will remember." Margaret stared at him. "What does that mean?" Hensley turned, and for a moment his pupils seemed wrong, too dark, too deep. "It means," he whispered, "that perhaps I was never the one who cured death. Perhaps it cured me." She took a step back, but his expression changed again, blank, as if waking from a trance. "Leave this place," he said, "before the next pulse." That night, the infirmary's gaslights flickered again. The humming returned, louder this time, pulsing through the floors like a heartbeat. Fletcher swore he saw shadows moving beneath the snow outside, circling the building. And somewhere deep below, in the cold heart of the basement, a second voice began to speak through the broken machine. Calm, patient, and eerily familiar. It wasn't Edward, it was the doctor. Margaret and Fletcher had begun piecing together the fragments of what had truly happened, tracing the whispers, the symbols, and the strange occurrences that surrounded Dr. Hensley. Each detail led them further from the public face of the infirmary and deeper into a labyrinth of secrecy hidden beneath London's streets. Hensley had always been meticulous, leaving behind no official trace of his experiments. But the city itself, the tunnels, the forgotten foundations, the hidden rooms, had recorded everything, silently waiting for someone brave enough to read it. It was Fletcher who first noticed a pattern in the journals he had secretly copied while Hensley slept. Among diagrams of circuitry, human anatomy, and strange chemical formulas, there were notes in a cipher, almost like a private diary. He realized that Hensley hadn't only been experimenting on Edward Pembroke, he had been experimenting for decades, collecting data from the city's poor, the ill, and the forgotten. Every missing patient, every miracle recovery was connected, forming a secret network of trials stretching back years. Margaret confronted Hensley in the study, demanding answers. For the first time, he did not deflect. "You think you understand," he said quietly, "but you only see the surface. Every success, every failure, was a step towards something larger. I was building a bridge between life and what lies beyond it." "What lies beyond?" she pressed. "The forgotten," he whispered. "The ones we bury without thought. They are the true witnesses. I've learned to listen to them, to pull them through the veil, just enough to learn what they know." Fletcher shivered. The implication was clear. Edward wasn't the first to return, and he wouldn't be the last. Hensley had been manipulating life and death for so long that the line between the doctor and the subject had blurred. Some of the recovered patients, Fletcher realized with a chill, must have retained more than consciousness. They remembered, and they waited. That night, Margaret and Fletcher explored the hidden tunnels themselves. The walls were lined with jars, each containing specimens preserved in formaldehyde. Some were human organs, others unidentifiable masses, pulsing faintly under the dim light. Symbols, the same that had appeared in the basement and outside, were etched into the floors and ceiling, connecting the jars in patterns that suggested ritual as much as science. In a small chamber, they discovered a ledger listing names, dates, and notes about each experiment. Some were clinical, others obsessive. Subject resisted, memories fragmented, vocalization intact, further adjustment required. One entry chilled them both. December 12, 1902, vessel complete. Subject recognizes experimenter as caretaker and jailer. Margaret realized that the boy they had seen, Edward, was not merely a patient. He was a vessel, a carrier of something older, something Hensley had unknowingly summoned. The experiments had created a bridge not just to life, but to something that could think, manipulate, and perhaps retaliate. They also found letters addressed to Hensley from unknown correspondents. One written in a careful, trembling hand praised his work and suggested methods for accelerating recovery. Another, darker, warned of consequences, speaking of spirits that do not forgive and the debt owed by those who tamper with the threshold of death. Whoever these people were, they had guided Hensley and watched from the shadows, ensuring that the experiments continued, that he did not work alone. Margaret shuddered as Fletcher whispered, "We're only seeing the surface. There are layers beneath layers, and some may never be uncovered." Then they heard it, the soft echo of movement in the tunnels behind them. Not footsteps, but something slithering, breathing, observing. They turned to leave, but the passage they had entered was no longer straight. It twisted unnaturally, leading them past more jars, more symbols, and finally to a locked iron door. Through the keyhole, they could see Edward, kneeling, staring at a bundle of wires and a strange, humming machine. He looked different now. Not quite human, but aware, intelligent, and terrified. As they watched, he lifted a hand and traced one of the symbols in the air. It glowed faintly, then disappeared. The boy whispered something they could not hear, yet it carried through the walls and struck them both with terror. Margaret understood then what Hensley had never admitted. The experiments had created connections that were not meant to exist, lines between worlds, minds and bodies that should have remained separate. Every person Hensley had touched, every soul he had revived, had left an imprint, a secret network that hummed beneath London, unseen and almost alive. When Hensley found them in the corridor, he did not yell. Instead, he smiled, the expression hollow and distant. "You see it now?" he said softly. You see the consequence of curiosity unchecked. These are not my mistakes alone. They are the city's, the world's, every injustice, every life interrupted. Margaret and Fletcher left the tunnels, hearts pounding, minds racing. Above them, London went on, unaware. But beneath the cobblestones, the secrets of Dr. Hensley's work waited, pulsing, listening, and preparing to remind anyone who dared disturb them that some doors, once opened, could never truly close. The final night came like a storm in the soul, sudden and unrelenting. London was quiet, eerily so, as if the city itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Inside the infirmary, gas lamps flickered against cracked plaster, throwing long shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. The hum that had haunted the tunnels beneath the building now reverberated through every floor, a low, pulsing heartbeat that synchronized with Margaret's own. Fletcher stood behind her, gripping a candle, his knuckles white. Neither dared speak. Words felt too heavy, too fragile for the darkness that awaited them. Dr. Hensley emerged from the east wing, his face pale, lips pressed thin. His eyes, once alive with fevered excitement, now glinted with an almost manic clarity. In his hands he carried Edward, or what had once been Edward. The boy's body seemed normal enough at first glance, but as they drew nearer, Margaret noticed the subtle wrongness, the tilt of his head, the unnatural stillness in his limbs, the way his eyes seemed to flicker between recognition and something older, something not his own. "He's ready," Hensley said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "The final step." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Final step," she demanded, but Fletcher shook his head, warning her not to provoke him. Hensley led them to the hidden chamber beneath the infirmary, the one lined with jars, symbols, and the humming apparatus that had so often pulsed through the walls like a living thing. Edward was placed on a raised table at the center, the coils and wires of Hensley's machine coiling around his body like serpents, the hum intensified, vibrating in their chests, in their bones, in every nerve. "Do you understand what you are about to see?" Hensley whispered. "This is not merely revival. This is the bridge between life and what lies beyond, between the soul and the body, between mortality and eternity." Margaret felt a cold dread settle over her. "You've done enough, Hensley. Stop this." He shook his head, voice trembling with both awe and mania. "No, you don't understand. It is not enough to wake him. I must listen. I must see. I must—" The machine's coils glowed bright blue, and Edward's chest convulsed violently. His eyes rolled back, revealing only blackness, yet his lips moved in whispers that carried through the chamber despite the silence. Hensley leaned closer, scribbling furiously on a pad of paper. Suddenly a voice erupted from Edward. Two voices, intertwined yet distinct. One was the boy's, terrified and pleading. The other was older, commanding, almost inhuman. It spoke directly to Hensley. "You should have left it buried," it said. "You did not create this. You merely awoke it." Hensley staggered back, pale. I control it. I can guide it. I can—" "No," the voice cut sharply. "You only borrowed what was never yours, and now it remembers everything." The jars along the walls vibrated violently, some shattering, releasing faintly glowing mist that twined through the chamber like serpentine spirits. Margaret felt a wave of nausea and fear. The symbols etched in chalk and blood across the floors and walls shimmered faintly, pulsating with a rhythm independent of the machine. Edward's body convulsed, then sat upright, unnaturally still. His eyes focused on Hensley with an intensity that made the doctor's knees buckle. "You wanted me to live," the boy, or the entity, said. "But life is not yours to give, and death is not yours to deny." Hensley fell to his knees, hands trembling. "I only wanted to help." "You have only bound us," the second voice said. "Every experiment, every revival, every stolen moment, it is a debt, and debts are paid." Margaret and Fletcher exchanged a glance of pure terror. The network of revived patients, the whispered names, the jars of organs and tissue, they were not mere experiments. They were vessels, echoes, bridges to something beyond comprehension. And now that something had returned, demanding reckoning. Suddenly, Edward's body rose, lifted by an unseen force, his limbs bending unnaturally. The humming of the machine became a roar, vibrating through the floors and walls, rattling lamps and scattering papers. Margaret could see shadows twisting around him, faces faintly recognizable in the mist, the forgotten, the stolen, the revived, all of them staring at Hensley with accusation and hunger. "You cannot control what has learned," the voice boomed, "and it remembers every injustice." Hensley screamed, a raw, desperate sound, as the room shook violently. Fletcher tried to grab Margaret, but the door slammed shut behind them. They were trapped in the chamber with the impossible, an entity born of man's hubris, fueled by centuries of hidden suffering, and now fully awakened. Then the climax came in a sudden, horrifying revelation. The machine's glow centered on Hensley, not Edward. Every coil, every wire seemed to draw toward him, as if the experiments had been preparing him all along. Edward, or whatever inhabited his body, was merely the vessel, the mirror reflecting back the consequences of the doctor's obsession. The voice whispered, soft now, but infinitely more terrifying. "You sought to conquer death, Doctor, but death does not forgive, and neither do we. You will carry what you created, you will remember everything, and you will never rest." Hensley's body convulsed as the force of the unseen presence engulfed him. His scream echoed through the chamber, blending with the voices of the other revived souls, each carrying a fragment of memory, a piece of injustice, a shard of torment. Margaret and Fletcher watched in frozen horror as the man who had once claimed to master life was now consumed by it, bound to the network he had created, unable to escape, unable to die. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the room fell silent. The machine lay dormant, cracked and smoking. Edward's body collapsed to the floor, lifeless, or perhaps merely empty. The jars were shattered, symbols dimmed, but the air still pulsed faintly, a reminder that what had been awakened had not been destroyed. Margaret knelt beside the boy, heart pounding. She touched his wrist. There was a faint pulse, not Edward's, not human. Something else lingered within, a memory, a consciousness that defied explanation. Fletcher whispered, voice trembling, It's over, isn't it?" Margaret shook her head. "No, it's never over, not really. Hensley thought he controlled life, but the true power, the reckoning, that belonged to them all along." Outside, London slept, oblivious. But beneath the streets, beneath the city's innocent hum, the network still pulsed. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the infirmary's ruined tunnels, one thought remained clear and unyielding. The line between life and death had been crossed, and those who had been taken were now awake. The events at the infirmary left an imprint far deeper than any wound or scar. Margaret and Fletcher emerged into a London dusted with frost, the streets quiet and indifferent to the horrors beneath their feet. The city went on, oblivious to the lives twisted by ambition and obsession, yet those who had witnessed the final night carried a weight that could not be shed. They had seen firsthand how one man's obsession to defy death had unleashed consequences that stretched beyond comprehension, linking the past and present in a network of suffering and memory. Margaret often walked past the infirmary afterward, her mind replaying the echoes of voices that were never meant to speak. She thought of Edward, or what had become of him, and the countless others whose lives had been commandeered by Hensley's relentless pursuit. These were not merely experiments, they were lives stolen, distorted, and forced to endure the liminal space between life and death. In the cold light of history, It was a reflection of the broader injustices of the age: the poor exploited, the powerless silenced, the young sacrificed for the vanity or ambition of the elite. Hensley, in his obsession, mirrored the cruelty embedded in the social fabric of Victorian London. Fletcher, too, struggled with understanding. As a man saved once by the same doctor he now feared, he wrestled with the moral ambiguity of intervention and responsibility. Could life ever be reclaimed without cost? Could mercy become tyranny? In their quest to preserve a single soul, Hensley had created a labyrinth of torment, forcing those he touched to become unwilling witnesses and, in some sense, accomplices. The ethical lines had blurred entirely. Science, ambition, and grief had merged into a perilous alchemy that defied the natural order. What lingered most painfully, however, was the realization that such injustices were not confined to the walls of the infirmary. History was replete with those who, in the name of progress, faith, or obsession, had crossed the boundary between right and wrong. The tale of Dr. Hensley became a mirror, a reminder that human ambition, untempered by conscience, could summon horrors just as real as any war or famine, affecting lives far beyond the immediate. The pain, the terror, and the echoes of those who had suffered were never fully contained. They lingered in the shadows, waiting to be remembered. Margaret and Fletcher spoke little of what they had seen, yet every glance, every silence, carried the weight of that night. Each object in their world, the faint hum of a machine, the chill of a darkened room, even the sound of footsteps echoing on stone, could awaken the memory of that liminal space where death and life collided. It was a lesson in vigilance, a call to observe the unseen consequences of human ambition, and a haunting testament to the fragility of the soul when tampered with by those who claim dominion over it. In reflecting on Hensley's deeds, they could not ignore the broader context. Victorian society was a stage for similar transgressions on a grand scale. Children worked until exhaustion, the poor suffered silently, and social hierarchies punished the weak. Hensley's experiments were a grotesque extension of these injustices, a concentrated microcosm of a world where the powerful imposed their will, indifferent to the suffering they caused. In this light, the story was not only one of supernatural horror, but also of human cruelty and moral corruption, echoing the realities of history that often went unrecorded. And yet, amidst the dread and reflection, there was a small, stubborn ember of hope. For those who survived the ordeal, the memory of Edward and the others became a moral compass, a warning that the pursuit of knowledge or power without empathy could summon forces beyond control. The past, remembered vividly through their trauma, became a lesson. Injustice left scars that could resonate for generations, and the ethical cost of tampering with life was never contained. As Margaret gazed across the quiet streets of London, she realized that the city itself was a witness. The cobblestones, the shadows, and the silent. Buildings carried the memory of those who suffered, just as they carried the footsteps of those who dared to confront the horrors hidden within. The story of Dr. Hensley, terrifying as it was, served as both a warning and a reflection. That even the most brilliant mind, when blinded by grief and obsession, could unleash a darkness that history itself would struggle to contain. And in that reflection lay the chilling truth: some mistakes, once made, echo forever. If the story of Edward Pembroke and Dr. Hensley has left you unsettled, shocked, or questioning the boundaries between life and death, you are not alone. What we have witnessed together is more than a tale of one man's obsession. It is a reminder of the hidden injustices that history often conceals and the consequences of tampering with forces beyond understanding. But there is still so much more to uncover, layers of secrets and darkness that history has tried to bury. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Hensley's intentions were truly noble, or was he blinded by his own arrogance? Could Edward's fate have been prevented, or was this an inevitability born from human ambition? Share your theories, your fears, and your reactions in the comments below. Every perspective adds to the conversation, and every comment helps bring these forgotten stories back into the light. If you felt the chill of Edward's return, the dread of what was unleashed in those hidden chambers, then you understand the importance of remembering. There are countless other tales like this, each more shocking, more haunting, and more mysterious than the last. By subscribing, you become part of a community that seeks out the darkest corners of history, exploring the truths that others fear to confront. Don't just watch, engage. Comment your thoughts, share this story with others who crave the hidden and the forbidden, and hit the subscribe button to ensure you never miss a story that challenges what you think you know about history. For those who stay until the end, you will also uncover exclusive insights that aren't available anywhere else. Behind-the-scenes research, clues to mysteries yet unsolved, and details that make these stories even more haunting. History is full of forgotten voices, and together we can give them life again. Type "I remember" in the comments if you feel the weight of this story, and let's continue to explore the shadows of the past, one dark tale at a time. If you are ready to uncover more, to face the chilling truths that history tries to hide, subscribe now, hit the bell, and join us. Because the more we remember, the less these secrets remain buried, and the more we understand the true cost of ambition, obsession, and injustice. As the candlelight flickers and London's streets settle into a quiet dawn, we are left with the echoes of what occurred beneath the infirmary. Margaret and Fletcher emerged from the shadows carrying the memory of Edward Pembroke, a boy whose life and afterlife was stolen and twisted by Dr. Hensley's obsession. The city goes on, unaware of the horrors that unfolded beneath its cobblestones, yet those who have witnessed such darkness carry it with them, forever changed. The story does not end with a closed door or a silent machine. The tremors of what was unleashed continue to pulse through the hidden corners of history, waiting to be discovered. What happened to Edward? Was he truly gone, or did some fragment of him remain, a silent witness to the horrors and injustices around him? The tunnels below the infirmary still whisper in the night, a faint hum that suggests the line between life and death may never be entirely severed. Hensley's obsession has left a legacy, one that serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when ambition eclipses morality, when curiosity overrides empathy, and when humanity is measured not by compassion, but by the limits it dares to challenge. Yet even in the face of such darkness, there is something to hold on to. Margaret and Fletcher survived, and through their eyes, we are reminded that courage and vigilance are vital when confronting the unknown. Their story, and Edward's, is a testament to the delicate balance between life and death, between justice and cruelty, and between the known and the unknowable. We are left to reflect on the lives manipulated, the suffering endured, and the moral consequences of playing God in a world where every action resonates beyond what we can imagine. And while this chapter closes, another waits. History is filled with shadows that have been ignored, stories that were never recorded, and secrets that refuse to remain buried. In the same streets of London, in the same alleys and forgotten buildings, countless mysteries linger, some of them terrifying, some tragic, and some that will challenge everything you think you know about the past. So, if you've followed this story to the end, if the fear and fascination have gripped you, as they have us, prepare yourself. The next mystery will take us even deeper, unveiling truths that are darker, more intricate and more shocking than anything we have seen before. It will explore new corners of history where injustice, obsession, and the supernatural intersect in ways that defy understanding. For those who stayed until the end, type "I guard the memory" in the comments below, and let us know that you stand witness to the forgotten voices, the echoes of the past that refuse to be silenced. Your curiosity, your courage, and your attention keep these stories alive. And remember, the past is never truly past. The shadows linger, waiting for the next story to reveal them. Prepare yourself, because our next tale will plunge us once again into the dark heart of history, and it promises to haunt you in ways you could never imagine.